If you can hear a bark under falling rain, it means someone is still fighting to be found. And that night, Sergeant Ethan Walker learned that truth the hard way. The storm had rolled into the coastal town without warning. Heavy clouds pressing down on rooftops like a lid that refused to lift, wind pushing sheets of rain across broken fences and flooded streets as Ethan moved through the debris field of a storm-damaged neighborhood where power lines hung like tired threads and every surface shimmered with cold water. He was a United States Marine assigned to assist local emergency response, his boots steady on soaked pavement, his uniform darkened by rain, but his posture unchanged, scanning every structure with a calm trained by years of discipline. Most houses had already been cleared, families relocated, shelters filled, yet something about this block felt unfinished, like a sentence left hanging in the air. Then he heard it, faint at first, almost swallowed by thunder, a sound that did not belong to the wind or the collapsing wood around him. It was a bark, broken and uneven, rising from somewhere beneath the remains of a house that had partially given way under the storm. Ethan stopped immediately, raising a hand to signal the nearby responders, but the others were already focused on clearing hazards farther down the street. He turned toward the structure, a two-story home with its front porch collapsed inward and siding torn loose, rain pouring through gaps like the house itself was exhaling its final breath. The bark came again, softer this time, but deliberate, as if trying to speak through exhaustion. Ethan approached slowly, each step measured, feeling the unstable ground beneath scattered beams and wet insulation. He called out once, voice steady, asking if anyone was inside, but only the rain answered. Still, the sound persisted, guiding him toward the side of the house where the foundation had shifted, creating a narrow opening beneath the structure. He knelt down, peering into the darkness beneath the broken floorboards, where the smell of wet earth and splintered wood filled the air. For a moment, all he could see was shadow and shifting rainwater, pooling in shallow dips. Then the bark came again, closer now, sharper, almost urgent. It was not loud, but it carried intention, like a signal repeated against fear. Ethan adjusted his position carefully, bracing one hand against a beam while lowering his flashlight with the other, the beam cutting through the darkness in slow arcs until it caught movement. There, beneath the fractured structure, something small shifted against the cold ground, barely visible, tucked between fallen planks as if the house itself had tried to hide it away from the storm. He leaned in further, heart steady but alert, recognizing the shape of a dog, a German shepherd, its coat soaked and clinging to its frame, eyes reflecting the light with a fragile persistence that held his attention completely. The animal did not retreat, did not bark again, only watched him, breathing uneven but steady, as if waiting for a decision that mattered more than the storm above. Ethan exhaled slowly, speaking in a low voice meant to calm rather than command, telling the dog it was not alone, that help was here, even if the world outside felt like it had already moved on. The dog shifted slightly, and beneath it he noticed another faint movement, something smaller pressed close for warmth and protection. In that moment, the storm above seemed to fade into distance, replaced by the quiet weight of what endurance looks like when no one is watching. Ethan adjusted his position again, careful not to disturb the fragile space, realizing that what he had heard was not just a call for help, but a refusal to disappear. And as the wind pressed harder against the broken house, he made a choice without hesitation, one that would keep him there long after the rest of the world had decided the scene was already over. The rain did not ease as Sergeant Ethan Walker stayed beneath the broken structure, only shifting slightly to shield his flashlight from the wind that pushed through the gaps of the shattered home. Every drop hitting the exposed beams above sounded heavier now, as if the storm itself had grown curious about what he had found. He kept his voice low, steady, speaking in calm phrases meant to reassure, rather than command, letting the sound travel into the darkness beneath the floor where the German shepherd remained motionless except for the rise and fall of its chest. Slowly, Ethan adjusted his position, pressing one hand against a stable beam while lowering himself further to gain a clearer view. The space beneath the house was narrow, a collapsed pocket of earth and timber that formed a fragile shelter from the storm, and within that confined space the dog had created a barrier around something unseen, its body angled protectively, as if refusing to let the outside world interfere. Ethan narrowed his eyes, the beam of light revealing more detail, noticing now that the dog's posture was not one of fear but of endurance, a quiet vigilance that suggested it had been holding its position for a long time. He felt a shift in his focus, the mission no longer about structural damage or storm response, but about understanding what had driven a living being to remain in such a place. Behind him, distant voices of responders faded in and out with the wind, but none approached the house, trusting his judgment as he continued alone. The dog's eyes met his again, steady and alert, and in that moment Ethan understood that it was not asking for rescue for itself, but for something it had refused to abandon. He spoke again, softer this time, assuring the animal that he was not there to take anything away, only to help, and as he did, the dog shifted just enough to reveal a small opening beside its chest. Ethan angled the flashlight carefully, breath slowing as the beam revealed movement beneath the dog's body, a faint rise and fall that did not belong to the adult animal. It was smaller, fragile, almost hidden within the curve of the shepherd's protective stance. He paused, instinct taking over caution, and adjusted his position to avoid startling either of them. The dog did not move away. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, maintaining its shield as if confirming that he had been permitted to see what lay beneath. Ethan felt a quiet tension settle in his chest, not fear, but the weight of witnessing something that had endured beyond expectation. He reached slowly toward the edge of the broken flooring, testing stability before committing further, his movements deliberate and controlled. The storm above pressed harder, wind forcing rain through the cracks, but beneath the house there was a stillness that felt separate from everything outside. The dog exhaled softly, a sound that carried exhaustion and trust in equal measure, and Ethan responded with a steadying breath of his own, continuing to clear small debris with careful hands. As he worked, the shape beneath the dog became clearer, revealing the unmistakable outline of a very young puppy pressed close to its protector, sheltered completely from the worst of the cold by the body above it. Ethan stopped for a moment, allowing the reality of what he was seeing to settle, the simplicity of it cutting through the chaos of the storm outside. The older dog had not moved from its position since he arrived, and now it was clear why. Every instinct it had was anchored to the fragile life beneath it. Ethan adjusted his radio but did not call it in yet, choosing instead to remain present in the moment, knowing that any sudden movement could disrupt the delicate balance that had held through the storm. He looked at the adult dog again and gave a slight nod, not as a command but as acknowledgement, as if recognizing a fellow survivor who had already done more than anyone could have asked. The dog held his gaze without blinking, its breathing steady but tired, as the rain continued to fall above them, marking time over a moment that felt suspended between struggle and relief. And in that quiet space beneath a broken house, something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding that survival sometimes depended not on strength alone, but on the choice to remain when everything else was falling apart. The space beneath the broken house had become quieter than the storm above it, as if the world outside no longer had permission to reach inside. Sergeant Ethan Walker remained steady in position, one knee pressed against damp soil, one hand braced against a fractured beam, while the other held his flashlight at a careful angle that avoided blinding the German shepherd. The animal had not moved from its protective stance, its body forming a curved shield over the small life beneath it, and every breath it took seemed measured, controlled, as though it understood that even the smallest disturbance could break something fragile. Ethan lowered his voice again, not because he expected instructions to be understood, but because tone itself carried meaning in moments like this. He told the dog it was safe, that help was not something to fear, and as he spoke, the dog's ears shifted slightly, acknowledging him without breaking focus. The puppy beneath it gave a faint sound, barely audible, a small sign of life that cut through the noise of rain and wood creaking above. Ethan paused, allowing the moment to settle, then carefully shifted another piece of broken board away from the edge of the opening. His movements were slow, deliberate, respecting the balance that had been maintained for far too long in such a dangerous space. The German shepherd did not resist, but it did not relax either, watching every motion with an intensity that suggested trust had to be earned even in crisis. Ethan noticed now how exhausted the adult dog truly was. Its coat soaked, its breathing uneven but persistent, yet it never once moved away from its position. There was something deeply focused in the way it remained, as if time itself had been reduced to a single purpose. Above them, the storm continued to press against the house. Wind slipping through broken siding, rainwater dripping into the hollow space beneath the floor, but none of it reached the small puppy fully protected at the center. Ethan adjusted his position again, shifting his flashlight lower, finally getting a clearer view of the fragile body beneath the shepherd. The puppy was pressed tightly against the warmth of its protector, barely visible except for the faint movement of its side rising and falling. Ethan felt a quiet heaviness in his chest, not from fear or urgency, but from recognition of what endurance can look like when nothing else is available except instinct and loyalty. He spoke softly again, almost under his breath, reassuring the dog that it had done enough, that it was no longer alone in this responsibility. But the shepherd only blinked slowly, as if acknowledging the words without accepting their conclusion. Ethan realized then that the animal was not waiting for permission to stop, because stopping had never been part of its decision. Carefully, he reached further into the debris field, moving small fragments of wood away from the opening to widen the space, without causing collapse. Each motion was controlled, tested, and rechecked, as though the stability of the entire structure depended on patience rather than force. The dog watched closely but did not interfere, maintaining its position even as the opening became slightly larger, enough for Ethan to see the full outline of what had been hidden beneath. The puppy remained still, its small body protected completely by the arc of the shepherd's frame, untouched by the cold wind that passed through the broken home above. Ethan felt the significance of the moment settle fully now, the understanding that what he had found was not just survival, but endurance shaped by instinct deeper than training or command. He stayed there for a moment without moving, letting the silence beneath the house speak in its own way, broken only by rain and the distant groan of shifting wood. The shepherd finally lowered its head slightly, not in surrender, but in exhaustion, as if recognizing that the presence beside it had become part of the moment rather than a threat to it. Ethan remained steady, his voice calm as he continued to assure both animals that help was here and that the storm no longer defined their outcome. And in that fragile space beneath broken timber and fading rain light, the line between rescue and witness blurred into something quieter, something that asked only for patience, presence, and the understanding that even in collapse, protection can still exist in its purest form. Sergeant Ethan Walker stayed in the same position beneath the broken house, but the moment had shifted in a way that could not be measured by time alone. The storm above still roared with heavy rain and wind, yet down in the narrow space beneath the fractured floor, everything felt controlled, as if the world had narrowed down to breath, light, and trust. Ethan adjusted his flashlight slightly, angling it away from the German shepherd's eyes, while keeping the beam steady enough to observe the fragile scene in front of him. The adult dog remained exactly where it was, still forming a protective arc around the puppy, but now its head was lowered just enough to suggest exhaustion pressing against instinct. Ethan spoke again, voice calm and deliberate, telling the dog that no one would take what it was protecting without care, that help was here, and that it did not need to carry everything alone anymore. The dog blinked slowly in response, not moving away, not resisting, only listening in the quiet way animals sometimes do when tone matters more than words. Ethan carefully extended his hand further into the debris, not toward the animals, but toward clearing a safe path that would allow him to eventually reach them without disrupting the fragile space they had created. Each piece of broken wood he moved revealed more of the hollow beneath the house, showing how narrowly the collapse had missed turning this space into something far worse. The puppy shifted slightly for the first time, a small movement that caused the German shepherd to immediately adjust its body, tightening its protective curve as if reacting to an invisible signal. Ethan noticed that response clearly, understanding that the connection between them was not passive but active, constantly adjusting to every change in pressure, sound, and presence. He paused again, letting the animals settle before making any further adjustments. And in that pause he became aware of just how long the dog had been holding this position, its muscles tense but unwavering, its focus absolute. The rain above intensified for a moment, sending a low vibration through the structure, and Ethan instinctively placed his hand against the beam to steady both himself and the fragile environment around him. The German Shepherd lifted its head slightly at the vibration but did not move away, only watched him with eyes that carried fatigue layered over determination. Ethan spoke softly again, not giving commands, not directing action, but simply acknowledging presence, as if assuring both animals that they were no longer unseen. Slowly, he began widening the access space a little more, pulling away fragments of soaked insulation and splintered wood, careful not to disturb the soil beneath that held everything in place. With each movement, more of the puppy became visible, still pressed against the warmth of the adult dog, still alive, still sheltered by something stronger than the storm outside. Ethan felt the weight of that realization settle deeper, not as urgency, but as respect for what had already been accomplished before he ever arrived. The German Shepherd finally shifted its front paw slightly, not away, but closer to the puppy, reinforcing its protective position even as the space around it opened. Ethan noticed that instinct immediately, understanding it as reassurance rather than resistance. He stopped for a moment, allowing silence to return beneath the house, listening to the rain above and the steady breathing below. Then he spoke again in a lower tone, telling the dog that it was not alone in this responsibility anymore, that whatever strength it had already shown was more than enough. The dog held his gaze for a long moment, then slowly lowered its head beside the puppy again, maintaining contact, maintaining protection, but allowing Ethan just enough space to continue. And in that quiet exchange beneath shattered wood and fading stormlight, something unspoken formed between them, not instruction, not command, but understanding that survival had already been decided by loyalty long before rescue ever arrived. Sergeant Ethan Walker remained beneath the fractured structure, but the atmosphere around him had changed in a way that was almost imperceptible at first, like a shift in pressure before a storm breaks again. The rain above continued to fall in steady sheets, yet beneath the house there was now a fragile rhythm of control, shaped not by weather but by presence, breath, and trust. Ethan adjusted his position carefully, sliding one knee deeper into the damp soil, while keeping his shoulders low enough to avoid disturbing the wooden beams above. His flashlight remained steady, angled downward to avoid overwhelming the German Shepherd that still held its protective stance. The dog had not moved away from the puppy, but there was a subtle change now, a slight easing in its shoulders, as if it had begun to recognize that the situation no longer depended on its complete isolation. Ethan spoke again, voice calm and low, not breaking the silence, but filling it gently, telling the dog that it had done everything right, that nothing more was required from it in this moment except to allow help to continue. The German Shepherd blinked slowly, its gaze shifting between Ethan and the space it had been guarding, as if processing words that did not need translation to be understood. Ethan carefully cleared another small section of debris, widening the space just enough to allow safer access, each movement deliberate and tested before committing fully. The structure above creaked faintly in response to the shifting weight, and he paused immediately, placing his hand against a stable beam to steady the environment before continuing. For a brief moment, everything became still again, the only movement the slow breathing of the animals and the steady rhythm of rain above the broken house. Ethan noticed that the puppy had shifted slightly closer to the adult dog's chest, pressing into the warmth that had kept it alive through the storm, and that simple motion carried more weight than anything else he had seen since arriving. The German Shepherd responded instantly, adjusting its body just enough to maintain full coverage, demonstrating a protective instinct that did not weaken even under exhaustion. Ethan felt a quiet respect settle deeper within him, not as an emotional reaction but as recognition of a choice that had already been made long before he arrived. He lowered his voice further, speaking not as authority but as reassurance, telling the dog that the space around them would remain stable, that no sudden force would be used, and that everything happening now was meant to help, not interrupt. The dog held his gaze for a long moment, then slowly exhaled, a sound that carried both fatigue and reluctant acceptance, and for the first time it did not reposition itself immediately after a vibration in the structure above. Ethan took that moment to extend his reach further into the debris field, carefully removing another layer of broken material that had trapped the hollow space beneath the floor. As he worked, the opening widened enough for more light to enter, and the outline of both animals became clearer, revealing just how small the puppy truly was compared to the body shielding it. The German Shepherd remained in place, but its head lowered slightly, resting closer to the ground, as if acknowledging that its role was still active but no longer isolated. Ethan paused again, ensuring no shift in weight would compromise the fragile balance, then spoke softly once more, telling the dog that it had protected life through conditions no one could reasonably endure alone. The dog's eyes remained fixed on him, steady but tired, and in that gaze there was no request for relief, only confirmation that the presence now sharing the space was trustworthy. Ethan slowly adjusted his position again, preparing for the next careful step of extraction, aware that even the smallest mistake could disrupt the delicate stability beneath the house. And in that narrow space filled with rain echoes, broken wood, and quiet breath, the bond formed between survival and intention became something unspoken but fully understood, as if all three of them had already agreed without needing words that the storm no longer defined what would happen next. Sergeant Ethan Walker stayed beneath the broken structure, but the silence that followed the previous moment felt heavier than the storm above, as if the entire world had narrowed to the space between breath and intention. The rain continued to fall outside in steady waves, but down beneath the fractured floor, even that sound felt distant, softened by earth and wood and the fragile shelter that still held. Ethan kept his flashlight steady, angling it carefully so the beam did not disturb the German Shepherd's eyes, which were now calmer than before yet still alert, watching him with a focus that suggested complete awareness of every movement. The puppy remained tucked beneath the adult dog, barely visible except for a faint rise and fall that confirmed life still held on within the smallest margins. Ethan adjusted his position slightly, shifting his weight to avoid pressing against unstable wood, and spoke in a quiet voice that carried reassurance rather than instruction, telling the dog that help was still here and that no part of this moment would be rushed. The German Shepherd blinked slowly, then shifted its gaze toward the opening Ethan had created, as if acknowledging that something beyond this small protected space was beginning to exist again. Above them, a faint change in sound reached through the storm, not thunder, not wind, but distant human voices carried intermittently through rain, signaling that additional responders had arrived nearby. Ethan paused, listening carefully, then responded through his radio in a low, controlled tone, giving precise location details while keeping his focus on the fragile balance beneath the structure. He did not move the animals yet, understanding that timing mattered more than urgency, and that even reassurance needed to be measured. The German Shepherd remained still, but its ears shifted slightly at the sound of distant voices, recognizing the presence of others without showing fear or resistance. Ethan returned his attention fully to the space beneath the floor, adjusting the flashlight again to widen visibility, ensuring that every angle of movement remained safe before proceeding further. The puppy made another small movement, subtle but enough to draw immediate protective response from the adult dog, which instinctively adjusted its body again to maintain full coverage. Ethan observed that response closely, noting not tension but instinctive care that had not weakened despite exhaustion. He spoke again, softer now, telling the dog that nothing would be taken away, only supported, and that the presence above them was there for the same reason he was. Slowly, more light entered the space as Ethan carefully shifted another fragment of debris, creating a clearer path without disturbing the surrounding structure. The opening now allowed a broader view of both animals, revealing the full curve of the German Shepherd's body wrapped around the puppy like a living shield that had not broken even once since he arrived. Ethan felt a quiet stillness settle inside him, not urgency but clarity, as he realized that what he was witnessing had already surpassed survival alone. The radio on his shoulder crackled again with distant coordination from the response team, but Ethan kept his movements steady and deliberate, ensuring that no sudden action would disrupt what had been preserved through sheer endurance. He spoke briefly into the radio, confirming that extraction would require careful coordination and time, then returned his attention immediately to the animals. The German Shepherd lifted its head slightly, eyes meeting his again, and for the first time there was a subtle easing in its posture, as if it had begun to understand that the burden it carried was no longer isolated. Ethan extended his hand a little further into the space, not to touch, but to guide and measure the safest path forward, and the dog did not retreat. Instead, it held its position while maintaining contact with the puppy beneath it, continuing its silent role without hesitation. The storm above continued its rhythm, but beneath the house the atmosphere had shifted into something quieter, something defined not by pressure but by presence. Ethan paused again, allowing the moment to stabilize, then spoke one more time in a steady voice, acknowledging the strength it had taken to remain where the dog had chosen to stay. The German Shepherd exhaled slowly, lowering its head just enough to rest closer to the puppy, not relinquishing its role, but accepting that it was no longer carrying it alone. And in that fragile space beneath broken wood and fading storm noise, the transition from isolation to shared effort began to take shape, not as a sudden change, but as a quiet understanding that rescue was no longer a question of if, but only of how gently it could be done. Sergeant Ethan Walker remained beneath the broken structure, but the environment around him had shifted again, this time in a way that felt less like tension and more like transition. The storm above was still present, but its intensity seemed to have softened slightly, as if even the weather had begun to lose its urgency. Down in the narrow space beneath the fractured house, the German Shepherd had not moved from its position, but its posture was no longer as rigid as before. There was still vigilance in its eyes, still awareness in every subtle movement, but something had changed in the way it held itself, as if it had begun to recognize that it was no longer alone in maintaining control of this fragile moment. Ethan adjusted his flashlight once more, carefully widening the beam so it illuminated both animals without overwhelming them, and spoke in a calm, steady voice that carried reassurance without force, telling the dog that the help arriving nearby was not a threat and that nothing would be taken away from what it had protected. The German Shepherd blinked slowly, its gaze shifting briefly toward the opening Ethan had created, where faint light from the storm filtered in through broken wood and shifting rain. Ethan could now hear more distinct movement above, footsteps in mud and distant voices coordinating outside the house, confirming that additional responders had reached the perimeter and were preparing to assist. He responded briefly over the radio, his voice controlled and precise, giving updated positioning while emphasizing the need for slow and careful extraction due to structural instability. Then he returned full focus to the space beneath him, understanding that the next phase required patience rather than action. The puppy shifted slightly again, a small motion that caused the German Shepherd to instinctively tighten its protective curve, but this time the response was less urgent, more measured, as if trust had begun to settle into instinct. Ethan noticed that change immediately, recognizing it as a critical turning point in the animal's behavior. He lowered his voice further, speaking not as a rescuer issuing commands, but as a presence confirming safety, telling the dog that no harm would come from what was happening above, only support. The German Shepherd held his gaze for a longer moment than before, then slowly exhaled, its shoulders easing just enough to signal acceptance of the environment beyond its control. Ethan carefully extended his reach again, not touching either animal, but continuing to clear the remaining debris that blocked a safe access path. Each movement was deliberate, testing stability before committing, ensuring that the fragile balance beneath the structure was not disrupted. As more space opened, the full outline of the puppy became clearer, still pressed against the adult dog's chest, still alive, still sheltered by warmth and presence that had not faltered since he first arrived. Ethan paused again, allowing the moment to stabilize fully, listening to the distant coordination outside and the steady rhythm of rain above, both now feeling less chaotic and more distant. The German Shepherd shifted its head slightly, not away from the puppy, but just enough to acknowledge Ethan's continued presence, as if recognizing that what stood beside it was no longer an unknown force, but part of the same effort. Ethan spoke softly once more, acknowledging the endurance it had taken to remain in this position through the storm, and the dog responded not with movement, but with stillness that carried understanding. In that stillness, something subtle changed, not in the physical space, but in the dynamic between all three of them, as the boundary between isolation and cooperation began to dissolve. The storm continued above, but beneath the broken house, the moment had transformed into one defined not by survival alone, but by shared recognition that what had been protected through instinct was now ready to be guided into safety. Sergeant Ethan Walker remained beneath the broken structure, but the moment he was in had reached a quiet threshold, as if everything that had been unstable was now waiting for the next deliberate action rather than reacting to chaos. The storm above still existed, but its presence felt more distant now, reduced to background noise as coordination from outside the house became more organized and controlled. Through the gaps in the shattered floorboards, faint silhouettes of additional responders could be seen moving carefully around the perimeter, their steps slow and intentional, as they assessed the safest way to assist. Ethan kept his position steady, one hand braced against a stable beam while the other held the flashlight low, ensuring the beam remained soft and non-intrusive. The German Shepherd beneath the structure had not moved from its protective stance, but its body language had shifted again, this time into something closer to calm endurance rather than defensive tension. The puppy remained pressed against its chest, still sheltered, still alive, its small form rising and falling with fragile consistency. Ethan spoke again in a calm, steady voice, acknowledging the presence of the incoming team without creating alarm, telling the dog that help was now fully in place and that nothing would happen suddenly or without care. The dog blinked slowly, its gaze shifting between Ethan and the light filtering through the broken structure above, as if registering the change in environment on a deeper level than instinct alone. Ethan carefully adjusted his position once more, widening the access space just enough for controlled movement without disturbing the remaining stability of the structure. Each action was deliberate, measured, and tested, reflecting the understanding that even success required precision in conditions like this. Above them, the responders communicated in low voices, confirming angles of approach and structural support points, their coordination now visible through small controlled movements rather than urgency. Ethan responded briefly over the radio, confirming that the animals were stable and that extraction needed to remain slow and synchronized. Then he returned his full attention to the space beneath him, watching closely as the German Shepherd finally shifted its weight slightly for the first time in a long while. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but it marked a change in readiness, as if the animal was beginning to accept that its role of absolute isolation was no longer necessary. Ethan noticed that shift immediately and spoke softly again, reinforcing that nothing would be taken away, only assisted, and that every step forward would be shared rather than imposed. The dog held his gaze for a long moment, then slowly lowered its head closer to the puppy, maintaining contact while allowing the surrounding space to become more accessible. Ethan extended his reach carefully, guiding debris away from the opening with controlled movements that ensured no sudden pressure was placed on the remaining structure. With each cleared fragment, the space grew slightly more open, allowing light from above to fall more clearly across both animals, revealing the full extent of the shelter the dog had maintained through the storm. The puppy remained safe, still fully supported by the adult dog's body, but now there was enough visibility for a coordinated extraction plan to begin forming above them. Ethan paused again, listening to the synchronized movements of the team outside, then spoke in a low, steady tone that carried through the opening, confirming readiness for the next phase. The German Shepherd did not resist, did not retreat, but instead remained still in a posture that reflected both exhaustion and trust, as if recognizing that the burden it had carried alone was now shared by those around it. And in that quiet space beneath fractured wood and fading storm echoes, the transition from isolation to coordinated rescue reached its final stage, where instinct and human care finally moved together in the same direction. Sergeant Ethan Walker remained beneath the broken structure as the final stage of the rescue began to unfold around him, the storm above now reduced to a distant background force compared to the coordinated movement of trained responders surrounding the house. The air felt different now, not because the weather had changed, but because human presence had filled the space with structure and intention. Ethan kept his position steady, one hand still braced against a stable beam, the other holding the flashlight low and controlled so that the beam continued to support visibility without disturbing the German shepherd beneath the floor. The animal remained in place, but its posture had shifted into something that resembled surrender without fear, exhaustion without collapse, trust without hesitation. The puppy was still pressed against its chest, still alive, still protected, but now the space around them had opened enough for safe extraction to begin. Ethan spoke in a calm, steady voice, confirming through his radio that conditions were stable and that the team above could proceed with slow, coordinated movement. Outside the structure, responders carefully secured support points, their movements precise and deliberate, ensuring that no additional pressure would destabilize the fragile remains of the house. Ethan watched closely, adjusting his position slightly to maintain visual contact with both animals while ensuring his presence did not interfere with the process. The German shepherd lifted its head once, briefly scanning the opening where light now poured more clearly through broken timber, then returned its gaze to Ethan as if seeking confirmation that nothing had changed in the promise of safety. Ethan responded immediately with a calm tone, telling the dog that everything happening around them was designed to help, not disrupt, and that every movement would be slow and controlled. The dog blinked slowly, then shifted its body just enough to allow the first careful approach from above. A responder's hand appeared through the opening, moving slowly and deliberately, offering presence before action, and Ethan observed the dog's reaction closely, ensuring no sudden tension would break the fragile trust that had formed. The German shepherd did not retreat, but it did not fully release its position either, maintaining contact with the puppy even as the space around them expanded. Ethan guided the process verbally, keeping his voice low and steady, reinforcing timing and caution as the team coordinated their movements with precision. The puppy was gently supported from below by the adult dog's body as the first careful extraction attempt was prepared, and Ethan adjusted his flashlight one final time to ensure visibility remained clear for everyone involved. The storm above had softened further, and now the only sounds were controlled movement, distant rain, and the quiet communication between responders working in sync. Ethan watched as the German shepherd finally allowed a slight shift in its protective stance, not as withdrawal, but as acceptance that the burden it had carried alone was now shared by those around it. The puppy was carefully and slowly lifted with coordinated care, supported at all times, ensuring no sudden movement disrupted the connection between the two. The adult dog did not resist, only followed the motion with its eyes, remaining close, remaining present, as if confirming that separation did not mean loss. Ethan spoke softly again, acknowledging the dog's endurance, its protection, and the fact that what it had done had already surpassed expectation long before human help arrived. As the puppy reached safety above, the German shepherd remained still for a moment longer, then slowly adjusted its position, finally releasing the tension it had held through the entire storm. Ethan remained beside it, steady and calm, ensuring the transition from confinement to safety was complete without disruption. And in that final quiet beneath the broken house, as the storm faded into background silence and human hands replaced isolation with care, the moment settled into something deeper than rescue alone, becoming a shared understanding that survival had never been only about escaping danger, but about refusing to abandon what mattered most until help finally arrived.